For 2.5 years, I've been building a sci-fi world with complex lore, intertwined characters, and stories. At the heart of this world is Aegis, and today we're traveling from Chokara eastwards to the Jogari Isles. I'll show you how I collaborated with one of YouTube's finest scratch builders, and I'll walk you through the entire process of crafting and painting this ship, and we'll end with a new short story. This is Gamey Builds, and welcome to Beyond the Blight. A few months ago, I reached out to Sublight Drive Crafts to propose a collaboration. Instead of sending each other a box of parts, we would each build the basic hull of a sci-fi ship and let the other artist finish in their style. To help me complete this project, I was sent this box from David, one of my viewers. I don't often accept these offers, but I'm glad I did this time, as this box was absolutely stuffed to the brim with useful plastic bits, from pod racer parts to airplane wings and cockpits. It was an absolute treasure trove, but it presented a problem that's gradually become worse. You see, I have so many sizes, shapes, and types of parts that it's become a huge pain to track down what I need when building. I decided to address this issue by repurposing this old rack of storage drawers. This was purchased from Costco when I was about 12 years old and was used for over 2 decades to organize specialized Lego pieces. It was a bit of a nostalgia trip going through all of this, but I'm not one for sentimentality, and it was time to put this rack to use for building new kinds of models. After sorting the Lego pieces into zipper bags, then peeling off all these decades-old labels, then thoroughly cleaning everything, I undertook the challenge of coming up with a new system of organization for my most often used plastic bits. To do this, I simply began sorting pieces from the box I'd received, putting similar sizes and shapes together, and once it was all laid out, I came up with classifications for each drawer, then printed labels and stuck them onto all the drawers. It was so nice to get this organized, and made me feel equipped to tackle the challenge of the collaboration. For those of you not familiar with my collaborator, Sublight Drive Crafts is an incredibly talented artist here on YouTube who scratch builds all sorts of spacecraft, some of which comes from games, others from 2D concept art, and still others of his own invention. I decided to use a foam dart gun as my base. There are a lot of great lines and shapes already built into these guns, but now it was a matter of transforming it into something more ship-like before sending it off. After taking it apart and sawing off the handle, I removed this bit here extruding from the barrel, then sanded everything down. I also sanded off these logos, which were screen printed onto the plastic, and thus slightly raised, meaning they'd be visible through the final paint job if not removed. Using modeling paste, I also covered up some of the details that I thought wouldn't work well at the smaller scale of a spacecraft. I then screwed the two halves back together, then filled the holes with hot glue and topped off with more modeling paste. Once the paste dried, I sanded it all down, then began to create a few templates to cover up the holes. I started with paper from index cards, then transferred the shapes onto styrene. These pieces were then used to glue to the body of the gun. A hole was next drilled into its center, and Gundam bits were used to detail all the faces. To be honest, I probably got a little carried away here, since technically the detailing and greeblying was the other guy's job, but it didn't feel right just sending him a mangled Nerf gun, and plus it was super hard to stop once I got some momentum going here. To really transform this gun into a sci-fi craft though, it needed some wings, which I had no shortage of thanks to the box I'd received earlier. I then covered this gap in the roof of the hull, beveled the edges slightly because it looked cool, then worked just a bit on this underside. I figured that if my collaborator didn't like any of these things, he could always hack them off later, but giving some unique details to this area would serve as a conceptual jumping off point. I envisioned this area as being some sort of exterior cargo hold, or possibly a refueling area for smaller craft. After adding just a few more details, I had to force myself to stop. I reminded myself that it wasn't my job to fix all the little things that bugged me, but instead leave enough empty canvas for Sublight Drive to work his magic. To find out exactly what he decided to do with this, be sure to check out his video next. After securely packing everything up with a few extra goodies, and of course plenty of Gamey Build stickers, I dropped it off at UPS and patiently waited for my box to arrive. And I was not disappointed when it did. Alright, I just got the box from Sublight Drive. So excited. Love these stickers. And some more bonus stickers, so awesome. Oh man, I love this design. And I really did. The shape immediately reminded me of an N1 Naboo starfighter, but with a boxier, more angular shape, which perfectly fit my style. After going through my bits tower for parts, I began adding details, this time affixing everything with Weld-On 3, a tip I picked up from Sublight himself. Unlike superglue, this stuff works by melting and fusing certain plastic together. This of course means a bit more toxicity to work with, but the resulting bond is extremely strong. You may be able to tell from this footage that it also evaporates very quickly, which is why it's recommended to work with it a little at a time from a separate metal container. With all the big pieces welded together, it was time to customize, starting with these wing flaps. After drilling holes, I decided to try my hand at panel lining with mediocre results. I then attached the fins via paperclip wire and weld-on to the main hull. I have to say that I was really beginning to see the benefits of using Weld-On 3. As mentioned in my last video, even ultra-thin superglue tends to leave residue behind, but Weld-On was practically invisible once dry. To match the protruding turbines on the nacelles interfaces, I pried away these greeblies, then set them aside for later use. And since I realized at this point that these faces hadn't been given panel lines, I decided to attempt this technique again, this time using a ruler as a guide. This worked out a lot better. After gluing the outer turbine protrusions, it was greebly time. Having my bit tower beside me as I worked really sped this process up, and the weld-on made affixing everything much cleaner than in previous builds. I suppose you could say this about anything, but model making is such an iceberg. What's immediately visible on the surface, the building, the painting, the weathering, is really just the tip of a much more massive set of nuanced skills. Things like knowing which glues and epoxies to use, how chemicals will react to different surfaces, the subtle textures left behind by various techniques. It's truly a matter of the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. There is just so much below the surface. My advice to anyone starting out on building models is to set modest goals. Make it your goal to learn something new with each project and improve incrementally. For the cockpit viewports, I first created templates for each of the faces using index cards. I then traced these out in Adobe Animate, and yes, I was dumb for using white paper here as a backing, or at least not putting some sort of dark thing behind it in the scanner. Nevertheless, I was eventually able to get all the shapes I wanted using a similar visual style to the Chokara patrol truck from a couple of builds ago. These viewports required a few attempts to get just right, as the angles were slightly off at first, but eventually I had something just right. I also attempted something new here, using my laser cutter on some 020 styrene to create these shapes, which would be the backing for all the viewports. By the way, this sci-fi aesthetic actually has a name, NASA Punk. Coined by the developers behind Starfield, it describes a sci-fi style that feels grounded, since it closely resembles designs and technology we already have. To make painting easier later on, I also taped all these pieces down and set them aside, then embarked on designing the base. I've had this weird triangle frame for ages now, never quite finding the right build to use it for. But with this ship's triangular shape, it was the perfect fit. For some added topology, I wire cut some 1-inch XPS foam and Gorilla Glued it into place. When using multiple layers, I kept things in place with toothpicks. A heat gun helped slightly deform the foam, and then I hot glued some clear acrylic to the sides to serve as a dam for a lumpy texture paste to blend everything together. This paste was made from water, toilet paper, plaster of Paris, and Mod Podge. This was then dribbled over the base, and while it was still wet, I pressed in some plaster rocks and gravel that had been leftovers from previous builds. I also sprinkled sand on top of everything, which achieved a neat gritty texture that combined well with the washes and paints used in a moment. Once the acrylic walls were removed, I coated all the foam edges in modeling paste, and when that had dried about a day later, I sanded it all down for a smooth finish. Building was now complete, but before we get into the story, I want to share the newest arrival to my store, these Automecha embroidered patches. The iron-on backing means they can be easily applied to denim and cotton, and if you prefer a Velcro option, I've got that in the shop as well. I've also got 2 brand new Grim Strider posters, so check out gameybuilds.com while supplies last. Helkara was the largest town on the archipelago known as the Jogari Isles, and on its eastern shore sat a squat and dingy pub. It was nothing special, but few places in Helkara were, and for the most part, that was the way the locals preferred it. Few among them had aspirations beyond the shores of their island, but for those who did, there was always the airbase. As the saying went, the best way to cross the horizon was up.
Patrolman Colmac, you're here early for a work day. What can I get you?
Drawled the bar owner, glancing up at the woman in the flight suit before clicking his tongue at a pair of half-sized automechas.
Salsa rum if you've got it, triple stiff, and I'm afraid it's just Kizza now, said the woman, tapping her lapel with a chipped fingernail, where the red and white flight insignia had gone missing.
No longer flying patrols?
Asked the man. He folded his arms across a large stained apron and frowned thoughtfully at her.
Not as of this afternoon, no,
Keza sighed. She raked long fingers through an uneven bob of dusty blonde hair. On the counter, one of the automechas juggled empty wine bottles for a pair of bright-eyed patrons who'd just brushed past the door chimes in the entryway. These were the only kind of customers that appreciated their tricks. The regulars, bleary-eyed clientele who'd spent more time in these bar stools than their own beds, mostly ignored the show, opting to gaze into the hypnotic abyss of their cups. She'd be one of them soon enough, she thought.
Look, Kez, I may not be the brightest light in the harbor, but I've got something of a knack when it comes to reading folks, and I've never pegged you for a quitter. Have your drink if you will, but I say first thing tomorrow you march back in that air base and demand a second chance. Whatever's happened can't be that bad.
None of it makes any sense, Keza muttered, as if completely missing the man's advice. I was just doing my job.
There you have it then. Nothing's so broke it can't be mended.
The owner took a half step back from Keza's table to make way for one of the tiny bartender automechas as it sidled up, sliding a tall glass of oily liquid onto the polished metal surface beside the woman. The mecha bowed with an indulgent theatrical flourish, but when the woman extended her arm to tap her wrist stripe to the back of its head for payment, the owner brushed her away.
I won't profit from your sorrows, Kez, he said.
Then, catching her questioning glance at the somber glut of barflies on the other side of the room, he shrugged.
At least not this first time. After that, you're on your own.
Thanks, Keza said, taking a sip. Did you know there are spike slethers in the jungles here? She asked.
Spike what? Repeated the man.
They're a variety of giant mudworm, not usual for this area, though I hear they're all over the Deadlands. Picture a 5-meter snake with fangs all over its body.
Venomous?
The man asked. No, they don't need to be. A spike slether gets a hold of you and you're lucky to make it 5 paces. The man mulled over this, grimacing. Well, I accidentally set my ship down in what looked like a shallow stream, but it was actually a slether nest. Those worms are slow, but most of their body remains underground, so they're incredibly strong. Once I'd noticed them, they'd already wrapped around my landing gear.
Scalded, the bar owner muttered. Jungle's a deadly place enough without killer worms. You're lucky to have gotten out alive.
I suppose I am.
But the base didn't see it that way, I assume. Surely they can salvage the ship.
These slethers were unusually large. Each worm must have been 6 or 7 meters above ground, spikes as long as my forearm.
Why'd you land your ship in the jungle? Seems an awful risk.
I spotted someone on the ground, a man wandering aimlessly.
A drunk? Hopefully not one of my regulars, the bar owner joked,
waggling his eyebrows in an attempt at levity. But Keza missed the joke as she swallowed another mouthful of rum. He was shivering when I approached him. Not a thread of clothing on his whole body either. Covered in mud and scrapes. Looked completely helpless, completely confused.
Lost tourist?
Keza shook her head. I didn't get too close at first. Called out for him to identify himself. You know what he said? The owner shrugged. He said his name was Zan Zameji.
Sounds like a Balami name.
And that's exactly what he claimed. He said, Keza began, her frown deepening. He said he was a lumberjack, working on one of the Balami lumber aisles.
Lumber aisles? The man scoffed. Weren't those the islands leveled in an air raid? 20 years ago, if I recall correctly.
18, I checked.
So the guy's a nut, a stim addict, a vagrant.
Keza shook her head again, more adamantly than before. He was lucid, coherent, just scared. Gave me details about his life, his work with the lumber corps. He even knew the exact balance in his employee account.
So, what happened to him?
I led him back to my ship, still cautious, of course. Told him I was armed, all that. When we arrived, that was when I noticed the spiked slethers wound around my landing gear. But as soon as he saw the worms, he panicked. It was like the sight of those things triggered something in him. He began screaming and screaming, saying he didn't want to go back, whatever that meant. And he ran away, disappearing into the jungle. I had a radio in for my rescue at this point, and when I got back to base, I told my superiors everything that had happened, and they took my wings away. The two of them let the pregnant paws hang in the air for a long time. Can I use your console? Asked the young woman, and the bar owner simply shrugged, pointing to a dull screen behind the counter. Abandoning her drink, she made her way around, and out of curiosity, the owner followed her. Keza's fingers trembled as she entered the name Zarn Zameji into the machine and waited. The two of them gasped as the results finally loaded and displayed on the console screen. There it was, right in the official registry of the Balami Lumber Corporation's missing persons, along with a grainy ID photo. It's him, Keza said. Thank you all so much for watching. It's been a blast seeing you all piece the stories and characters together in the comments. That feedback means so much to me, and I'm happy to have you along for the ride. Until next time, this is Gamey Builds, over and out.